Picture this: Montauk Point, Long Island, the easternmost tip of New York, where the land finally surrenders to the Atlantic Ocean, and there's nothing between you and Europe but 3,000 miles of cold, grey water. It's a beautiful place, rugged, windswept, the kind of landscape that makes you feel small in all the right ways. Tourists come here for the lighthouse, one of the oldest in America, commissioned by George Washington himself. They come for the beaches, the hiking trails, the seafood restaurants in the little town nearby. But if you walk past the lighthouse, past the scenic overlooks, and the families taking photographs, you'll find something else. Something that doesn't quite fit the pastoral charm of a state park. A radar dish. Massive. Maybe 100 feet across. Rusting now, its white paint peeling, its mechanical joints frozen by decades of salt air and neglect. It sits on top of a concrete bunker, pointing at the sky like a blind eye, searching for something it will never find. This is Camp Hero, or what's left of it. During World War II, this was a military base disguised as a fishing village, fake buildings with painted windows, designed to fool German U-boats and aircraft. During the Cold War, it became Montauk Air Force Station, part of America's early warning system against Soviet nuclear attack. That radar dish was supposed to spot incoming bombers before they could reach New York City. The base was decommissioned in 1981. The military packed up and left. But they didn't take everything. The radar dish was too big, too specialized, too expensive to move, so they just left it there, along with the bunkers, the underground tunnels, the concrete rooms where classified equipment once hummed with purpose. For years, the base sat abandoned, fences sagging, buildings crumbling, the kind of place teenagers would sneak into on dares, flashlights cutting through darkness that felt somehow thicker than normal darkness should feel. And that's when the stories started. Stories about what really happened at Camp Hero. Stories about experiments that continued long after the base was supposedly closed. Stories about children with psychic powers, about portals to other dimensions, about government scientists playing with forces they couldn't control. Stories about time travel. If you've watched Stranger Things, and statistically you probably have, you already know this story, or a version of it. The Duffer Brothers originally called their show Montauk. It was going to be set here, at this base, drawing directly from the conspiracy theories that had grown up around this place like kudzu on an abandoned building. Netflix made them change it, move the setting to Indiana, call it Hawkins instead of Montauk, distance the fiction from the conspiracy theory that inspired it. But the DNA remains. 11, the girl with telekinetic powers, raised in a government laboratory, experimented on by men in white coats. She's a Montauk creation. The upside down, that shadowy dimension bleeding into our reality through a tear in space-time, that's Montauk too. The secret government facility where terrible things happen to children in the name of national security. All of it traces back to the stories people told about this rusting radar dish on the tip of Long Island. So here's the question that's going to haunt us for the next hour or so. How much of it is true? Not the time travel, not the interdimensional portals. Those require physics that doesn't exist, technology that's never been demonstrated, capabilities that remain firmly in the realm of science fiction. But what about the rest of it? The government experiments on unwitting subjects, the mind control research, the exploitation of vulnerable people, including children, in the name of national security. Because here's the thing, If you watched our video on MKULTRA, the CIA's documented, verified, congressional testimony, confirmed mind control program, you know that some of those things actually happened. Not at Montauk, necessarily, but in laboratories and hospitals and prisons across America, the government really did conduct horrific experiments on its own citizens. Really did dose people with LSD without their knowledge. Really did use electroshock and sensory deprivation to try to break and rebuild human minds. Really did target the vulnerable, prisoners, psychiatric patients, the poor, because their suffering wouldn't matter to anyone with power. MK Ultra was real, documented, proven beyond any reasonable doubt. So when someone says, the government conducted secret experiments at Montauk, well, we can't just dismiss that out of hand. We live in a world where the paranoid interpretation has sometimes been the accurate one, where conspiracy theories have sometimes been understatements of what was actually happening. That's the trap we're caught in. That's the legacy of real government atrocities. They make imaginary ones feel plausible. They poison our ability to distinguish between documented horror and invented mythology. Tonight, we're going to try to navigate that trap. We're going to examine the Montauk Project, not as believers, not as debunkers, but as investigators trying to understand what's real, what's mythology, and why this particular story has such a grip on the American imagination. We're going to meet the men who first told this story and examine their credibility. We're going to hear the specific claims, the Montauk chair, the time travel experiments, the children with psychic powers, the beast that emerged from someone's nightmares. We're going to dig into the documented history of Camp Hero, what we can actually verify happened there. And we're going to confront the uncomfortable question that lurks beneath all conspiracy theories in post-MKULTRA America. How do we know what to believe when our government has proven itself capable of the unthinkable? This is the story of the Montauk Project, the conspiracy theory that inspired Stranger Things, the mythology that grew in the shadow of documented atrocity, the impossible claims that feel disturbingly possible in a world where the impossible has already been proven true. Before we descend into this labyrinth of fact and fiction, I want to ask something of you. This channel exists to investigate the shadows, the places where official history breaks down and something stranger emerges. If you believe these investigations matter, if you want to keep exploring the darkness with me, you can help by subscribing and hitting the notification bell. Your support makes this work possible. Tonight's investigation will take us through several layers of this mystery. First, we'll examine the real history of Camp Hero, the documented facts about what this military installation actually was, what it actually did, and why it was abandoned. Then we'll meet the Storytellers, the men who first claimed to have recovered memories of working on the Montauk Project, and we'll assess their credibility with the same rigor we'd apply to any historical source. We'll hear the mythology in full, the Montauk chair, the time tunnels, the Philadelphia experiment connection, the experiments on children, the beast that supposedly ended it all. We'll investigate what can actually be verified and confront how little that turns out to be. We'll trace how this conspiracy theory became pop culture, how Montauk became Hawkins, how conspiracy became Stranger Things, and what that transformation tells us about how we process collective trauma through fiction. And finally, we'll wrestle with the deeper question. In a world where MK Ultra was real, how do we evaluate extraordinary claims? Where's the line between healthy skepticism and naive dismissal? This is a story about what happens when real horror creates permission for imaginary horror. When documented atrocity makes mythology feel plausible. When we can no longer trust our institutions to tell us the truth. And so we're left to navigate a landscape where anything seems possible. Even time travel, even psychic children, even monsters emerging from the depths of human consciousness. Let's begin where all good investigations begin, with what we can actually prove. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. The year is 1942. America has just entered World War II. German U-boats are prowling the Atlantic coast, sinking merchant ships within sight of American beaches. The threat of invasion, or at least of devastating coastal raids, feels very real. Montauk Point, at the far eastern tip of Long Island, is strategically critical. It's the closest point to Europe on this stretch of coastline. Any attack on New York City from the Atlantic would likely pass within range of observers stationed here. So the army builds a base, but not just any base. Camp Hero is designed to be invisible, or rather, to look like something it's not. From the air or from the sea, the base is supposed to look like a quiet fishing village. The buildings are constructed to resemble civilian structures, houses, churches, a water tower. Some have fake windows painted on their walls. Roads are laid out in the meandering pattern of a small town, rather than the efficient grid of a military installation. It's camouflage on an architectural scale. If German reconnaissance planes photograph the area, they'll see a sleepy coastal community, not a military target. Behind that disguise, Camp Hero is bristling with weapons. Massive gun batteries capable of hitting ships miles offshore. Fire control stations to coordinate the batteries. Bunkers and ammunition magazines. Barracks for hundreds of soldiers. Everything needed to defend this stretch of coastline from naval attack. The attack never comes. German U-boats do sink ships off the American coast, more than 600 vessels in 1942 alone. But the feared invasion never materializes. The guns of Camp Hero never fire in anger. The soldiers stationed there spend the war watching an ocean that remains, from their perspective, disappointingly peaceful. But the infrastructure remains. The bunkers, the underground facilities, the carefully maintained fiction of a fishing village that was never really a fishing village at all. When World War II ends, the military doesn't abandon Camp Hero. They transform it. By the late 1940s, a new enemy has replaced Nazi Germany in American nightmares. The Soviet Union, communism, the specter of nuclear annihilation. The threat has changed, but Montauk's strategic value remains. If Soviet bombers ever came to destroy New York City, they'd approach from the northeast, over the Atlantic. Montauk would be one of the first places to spot them. In 1951, the Air Force takes over from the Army. Camp Hero becomes Montauk Air Force Station. The coastal guns are removed. They're obsolete now, useless against aircraft, and replaced with something more suited to the new threat. Radar. The base becomes part of SAGE, the semi-automatic ground environment. It's one of the most ambitious and expensive military projects of the Cold War era. A networked system of radar stations and command centers designed to detect and track Soviet bombers in real time, coordinating America's air defenses across the entire continent. At Montauk, the centerpiece of this system is the AN/FPS-35 radar, that massive dish that still stands today, rusting against the Long Island sky. It's a powerful long-range radar, capable of detecting aircraft hundreds of miles away. It scans the horizon constantly, feeding data to SAGE command centers where operators would coordinate interceptor aircraft if Soviet bombers were ever detected. The base expands. New buildings, more sophisticated equipment, underground facilities to protect critical systems from attack. At its peak, Montauk Air Force Station employs several hundred military and civilian personnel, and it's classified, heavily classified. The specifics of SAGE technology, the capabilities of the radar systems, the procedures for coordinating air defenses, all of it is secret. Unauthorized civilians aren't allowed near the base. Armed guards patrol the perimeter. The people who work there don't talk about what they do. This secrecy is normal, expected. It's the Cold War, and the Soviets would love to know exactly how American air defenses work. Of course, Montauk is classified, but secrecy breeds suspicion. When people can't know what's happening behind those fences, they start to imagine. And sometimes, what they imagine is worse than reality, or sometimes it isn't. By the 1970s, the strategic calculus has changed again. Soviet bombers are no longer the primary threat. Intercontinental ballistic missiles are. You can't shoot down an ICBM with interceptor aircraft. The elaborate SAGE system, designed for a different kind of war, is becoming obsolete. More practically, satellite technology and over-the-horizon radar make coastal radar stations less necessary. Why maintain expensive facilities at Montauk when you can see the entire Atlantic from space? In 1981, Montauk Air Force Station is officially decommissioned. The military packs up and leaves. But they don't take everything. The AN/FPS-35 radar dish is massive, specialized, too expensive to move, too unique to be useful anywhere else. So it stays, along with the bunkers, the underground tunnels, the strange architecture of a fake fishing village that served as military camouflage for 40 years. The base sits abandoned. For years, it's just there. Fences rusting, buildings deteriorating, nature slowly reclaiming what the military built. Local teenagers sneak in. Urban explorers document the decay. The bunkers are dark and damp, full of mysterious equipment left behind. The underground tunnels branch and twist in ways that weren't on any public map. The radar dish looms over everything, a monument to a war that was fought with paranoia and preparation rather than actual combat. It's a perfect setting for stories. An abandoned military base, secret facilities, underground tunnels that might lead anywhere, decades of classified operations that no one will explain. All of it sitting at the edge of the Atlantic, at the end of Long Island, in a place that feels somehow liminal, caught between land and sea, between the ordinary world and something else. And then, in 1992, the stories arrive. Before we meet the storytellers, we need to understand why anyone believed them. The early 1990s are a specific moment in American culture. The Cold War has just ended. The Soviet Union has collapsed. For decades, Americans had organized their understanding of the world around that conflict. Us versus them, freedom versus communism, the free world versus the evil empire. And now it's over. The enemy is gone. The organizing principle of American foreign policy for 50 years has simply dissolved. That creates a vacuum, a need for new narratives, new enemies, new explanations for the anxiety that doesn't go away just because the Soviet missiles have been decommissioned. At the same time, Americans have just learned are still learning the truth about what their own government did during the Cold War. MK Ultra was exposed in 1975, but the implications took decades to fully absorb. The idea that the CIA had drugged American citizens, experimented on psychiatric patients, destroyed evidence, and faced almost no consequences. That takes time to process. Each new revelation, each lawsuit that comes to light, each victim who tells their story, reinforces the lesson. Your government will do terrible things and lie about it. The Church Committee hearings revealed domestic surveillance programs. COINTELPRO showed the FBI spying on civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, anyone deemed subversive. The Iran-Contra scandal demonstrated that the executive branch would conduct illegal operations and then lie to Congress about them. By the early 1990s, there's a pervasive sense that the government cannot be trusted, that official stories are probably lies, that the truth is always darker than what they're telling you. This is the soil in which the Montauk mythology will grow. And the final ingredient, recovered memory therapy. In the 1980s and early 1990s, there's a widespread belief, later largely discredited, that traumatic memories can be repressed and then recovered through therapeutic techniques. Hypnosis, guided imagery, regression therapy. This belief powers the satanic panic, in which hundreds of people recover memories of ritual abuse that almost certainly never occurred. It leads to wrongful convictions, destroyed families, moral panics about daycare centers, and recovered memories of crimes that never happened. But in this moment, before the backlash, recovered memory is taken seriously. If someone claims to have recovered memories of government experiments, that claim has a certain cultural credibility. It fits the template. It sounds like how trauma works. So when a man named Preston Nichols claims that he's recovered memories of working on a secret government project at Montauk Air Force Station, a project involving mind control, time travel, and experiments on children, some people are ready to believe him. Not everyone, not most people, but enough. Enough to buy the books, enough to attend the lectures, enough to keep the story alive and growing for 3 decades, enough to eventually inspire one of the most popular television shows of the 21st century. The primary architect of the Montauk mythology is a man named Preston B. Nichols. By his own account, Nichols was an electrical engineer who worked in the defense industry. He had expertise in electromagnetic fields, signal processing, radio frequency technology, the kind of technical background that makes someone sound credible when they start talking about secret government experiments involving exotic physics. According to Nichols, he began recovering memories in the late 1980s, memories of a second life he'd been living without knowing it. Memories of work he'd done at Montauk Air Force Station that had been erased from his conscious mind but remained buried in his subconscious. He claimed that he would go to work at his regular job during the day, but at night, sometimes several nights a week, he would be transported to Montauk for secret experiments. His memories of these sessions were suppressed, but they started breaking through in fragments. Dreams that felt too real. Skills he shouldn't have. A growing sense that his life had hidden compartments he couldn't quite access. With the help of a regression therapist, Nichols claimed to recover more and more of these buried memories. And what he remembered was extraordinary. He remembered working on something called the Montauk chair, a device that could amplify human psychic abilities to an astonishing degree. A person sitting in the chair could supposedly project their thoughts into reality. They could create objects out of nothing, open portals to other times and places, manifest their imagination in physical form. He remembered experiments on children, young boys mostly, selected for their psychic potential. These children were trained, conditioned, sometimes abused, in order to enhance their abilities. Some of them, Nichols claimed, were runaways or homeless kids, expendable. Their disappearances wouldn't be investigated. He remembered time travel, portals that could send people backward or forward in time. Experiments where subjects were sent to other eras and sometimes didn't come back, attempts to change history itself. He remembered the disaster that ended the project, a subject in the chair who lost control and accidentally manifested a monster, a beast that rampaged through the underground facility until someone had the presence of mind to destroy the equipment and close the portal. In 1992, Nichols published these claims in a book called The Montauk Project, Experiments in Time, co-written with Peter Moon. It was self-published initially, distributed through alternative bookstores and at UFO conferences. It found an audience among people who were already inclined to believe in government conspiracies and fringe science. The book was a modest success by the standards of that world. It led to sequels, Montauk Revisited, Pyramids of Montauk, The Music of Time, each one expanding the mythology, adding new claims, connecting Montauk to ancient civilizations, alien contact, the secrets of human consciousness. Nichols became a fixture on the conspiracy lecture circuit. He gave talks, sold books, offered tours of the Montauk area. He accumulated followers who believed his recovered memories and wanted to know more. He died in 2018. By then, his stories had taken on a life of their own, far beyond anything he could control. Nichols didn't create the Montauk mythology alone. His co-author, Peter Moon, was essential to shaping how the story was told and distributed. Moon's background is relevant. Before becoming involved with Montauk, he was deeply involved with Scientology. He'd studied the organization's teachings extensively and had particular interest in L. Ron Hubbard's ideas about the mind, consciousness, and hidden human potential. This isn't necessarily discrediting. People can have unconventional spiritual backgrounds and still tell the truth about other things. But it does suggest a pre-existing framework, a way of understanding the world that was receptive to certain kinds of claims. Ideas about suppressed memories, hidden abilities, secret knowledge, withheld from ordinary people, these fit neatly into the Scientological worldview. Moon founded Sky Books, the publishing company that released the Montauk series. He edited Nichols's accounts into readable narratives. He connected the Montauk claims to broader esoteric traditions, ancient Egypt, sacred geometry, mystical bloodlines. He gave the mythology depth and texture, transforming what might have been a simple conspiracy theory into a complex alternative history of human civilization. Whether Moon believed the claims he was publishing, or whether he saw a commercial opportunity in the hungry market for conspiracy content, is impossible to know from the outside. Perhaps both. Perhaps the distinction doesn't matter. What matters is that the Nichols-Moon partnership created a body of work, dozens of books, lectures, interviews, that established Montauk as one of the foundational conspiracy theories of the late 20th century. The third major figure in the Montauk mythology is Alfred Bielek, who claimed to be not just a witness, but a participant, and not just in the Montauk experiments, but in an earlier project that Montauk supposedly continued, the Philadelphia experiment. According to legend, and it is a legend with no credible documentary support, the US Navy conducted an experiment in 1943 to make a ship invisible. The USS Eldridge, a destroyer escort, was supposedly outfitted with experimental equipment based on Einstein's unified field theory. When the equipment was activated, the ship didn't just become invisible to radar, it physically disappeared, teleporting from Philadelphia to Norfolk, Virginia, and back. The experiment, in this telling, was a disaster. Sailors were fused with the ship's structure when it rematerialized. Others went insane. Some disappeared entirely, phasing in and out of visibility for years afterward. The Navy covered up the incident and never attempted the experiment again. Al Bielek claimed to have been there. He said his name was originally Edward Cameron, that he served aboard the Eldridge during the 1943 experiment, and that during the ship's uncontrolled teleportation, he and his brother jumped overboard and landed at Montauk in 1983. Time travel. He claimed to have traveled 40 years into the future by accident. According to Bielek, he spent time at the Montauk facility before being sent back to 1943, but he couldn't be returned to his original identity, something about the timeline being compromised. So, his memories were erased. His body was somehow age regressed to infancy, and he was given a new identity. Alfred Bielek, raised by a new family, with no memory of being Edward Cameron, or of the Philadelphia experiment, or of Montauk. Until the memories started coming back, in the 1980s, at roughly the same time that Preston Nichols was recovering his own suppressed memories. Bielek became a frequent collaborator with Nichols and Moon. He appeared at conferences, gave interviews, elaborated on the mythology. He claimed to have visited the far future, the year 6037, and to have witnessed the aftermath of nuclear war and the recovery of human civilization. He provided testimony that connected the Philadelphia experiment to Montauk, to broader government conspiracies involving time travel and reality manipulation. The claims are extraordinary, and they have no documentary support whatsoever. No Navy records confirming the Philadelphia experiment. No birth records for an Edward Cameron that match Bielek's claims. No corroborating witnesses from either 1943 or 1983. Al Bielek died in 2011. Like Nichols, he left behind a body of testimony that believers treat as revelation and skeptics dismiss as fantasy. So how do we evaluate these claims? I want to be careful here. It would be easy to simply dismiss Nichols, Moon, and Bielek as liars or lunatics. Easy, but not necessarily fair or useful. The question isn't whether we find their claims believable. Most people don't. But what standards we should apply when evaluating extraordinary claims. Let's start with what we'd want to see if the Montauk claims were true. Documentation. Government programs leave paper trails. Even MK Ultra, despite the destruction of 80% of its files, left enough documentation to prove it existed. Budget records, personnel files, memoranda, contracts with outside institutions. If Montauk was real, where are the documents? The answer from believers is that the documents were destroyed or remain classified. That's possible, as MKULTRA proved, The government is capable of destroying evidence, but it's also unfalsifiable. You can't prove a negative. The absence of evidence becomes, in the believer's mind, evidence of how thorough the cover-up was. Corroborating witnesses. Nichols claimed that hundreds of people worked on the Montauk project. Where are they? MKULTRA was exposed partly because victims came forward. People like Velma Orlikov and Linda MacDonald, who had no reason to lie about what was done to them. For Montauk, we have a handful of claimants, all of whom are connected to each other and to the book-selling enterprise. No independent witnesses, no victims coming forward with consistent stories. Physical evidence, time travel, teleportation, manifesting objects from thought. These are extraordinary claims that would require physics we don't currently understand. If the government had developed such capabilities in the 1970s and 80s, there should be some physical evidence. Artifacts, anomalies, technology that can be examined. Instead, there's nothing but stories, recovered memories. The foundation of both Nichols's and Bielek's claims is that their memories were suppressed and then recovered through therapeutic techniques. But we now know that recovered memory therapy is unreliable at best. The human mind doesn't work like a hard drive where deleted files can be restored. Recovered memories are often false memories, created through suggestion and the desire to find meaning in fragmentary experiences. This doesn't prove that Nichols and Bielek were lying. Perhaps they genuinely believed what they were saying, but it does suggest that their beliefs may not have corresponded to external reality. They may have been victims of a therapeutic process that created memories rather than uncovering them. Consistency. Over the years, the Montauk claims grew more elaborate. New elements were added. Connections to ancient Egypt, to Nazi experiments, to alien contact. This is a red flag for fabrication. Real memories tend to remain stable over time. Invented or false memories tend to elaborate, adding details and connections that weren't present in earlier tellings. Financial incentive. Nichols and Moon sold books, gave paid lectures, built careers around the Montauk mythology. This doesn't prove they were lying. Whistleblowers have to make a living too, but it's worth noting. There was money to be made in telling this story. The honest assessment, the Montauk Project claims fail every test we would normally apply to evaluate extraordinary assertions. No documentation, no independent witnesses, no physical evidence, reliance on discredited memory recovery techniques, escalating elaboration over time, financial incentives for the claimants. Compare this to MKULTRA. When that program was exposed, there were documents, not complete but substantial. There were multiple independent witnesses. There were victims who had no connection to each other, telling consistent stories. There was institutional acknowledgement. The CIA admitted the program existed. Montauk has none of that. What it has is a compelling narrative told by people who may have genuinely believed it in a cultural moment when Americans were primed to believe the worst about their government. The story is almost certainly not true in its specific claims. There was probably no time travel at Montauk, no psychic children in chairs, no monsters manifested from human consciousness. But that doesn't mean the story isn't important. It doesn't mean there's nothing to learn from why it exists and why people believe it. Let's hear the mythology in full. Then we can talk about what it really means. According to the Montauk mythology, The experiments at Camp Hero didn't begin there. They were the continuation of a much older project, one that started during World War II and evolved through decades of secret research. The story goes like this. In 1943, the US Navy conducted the Philadelphia experiment, the attempt to make the USS Eldridge invisible that supposedly resulted in teleportation, temporal displacement, and the gruesome deaths of sailors who were fused with the ship's structure. The Navy officially denies the Philadelphia experiment ever occurred, and there's no credible evidence that it did. But in the mythology, it's the foundational event, the moment when American scientists stumbled onto something they didn't understand. Forces that could bend space and time. Capabilities that were too dangerous to develop openly, but too powerful to abandon. After World War II, according to this narrative, the research continued under various code names. Project Rainbow, the Phoenix Project. Each iteration building on what came before, each one pushing deeper into the mysteries of space-time and human consciousness. By the 1970s, the mythology claims the research had advanced enough to require a dedicated facility, somewhere isolated, somewhere with existing military infrastructure that could be repurposed, somewhere that wouldn't attract attention. Montauk Air Force Station fit the bill perfectly. It was remote. It had underground facilities. It had been a classified installation for decades. One more secret wouldn't be noticed. In this telling, the 1981 closure of the base was a cover. The radar operations stopped, yes. The official military presence ended. But beneath the surface, in tunnels that went deeper than any public map showed, the real work continued. The Montauk Project. At the center of the mythology is a device called the Montauk Chair. According to Nichols, the chair was a technological amplifier for human psychic abilities. It consisted of a seat, something like a dentist's chair or an electric chair, surrounded by sophisticated electronic equipment, coils and antennae, banks of computers, receivers and transmitters that could pick up and broadcast the electromagnetic signatures of human thought. The technology supposedly derived from several sources. Some came from the wreckage of crashed alien spacecraft, because the Montauk mythology intersects with UFO conspiracy theories, as most conspiracy theories eventually do. Some came from Nazi scientists brought to America after World War II, who had been conducting their own research into the paranormal. And some was developed through decades of American black budget research, building on the Philadelphia experiment's accidental discoveries. A person sitting in the chair, a psychically gifted person specifically, would enter an altered state of consciousness. Their thoughts would be captured, amplified, and broadcast by the equipment. And those thoughts could affect reality. At first, in this telling, the effects were subtle. A person in the chair could influence the emotions of people nearby. They could make someone feel fear, joy, anger, whatever they focused on. This was potentially useful for intelligence work, for interrogation, for manipulation of enemy populations. But as the technology improved and operators became more skilled, the effects became more dramatic. A person in the chair could create solid objects out of nothing, thinking of a hammer and having a hammer appear. They could teleport objects from one location to another. They could see events in other times and places. Eventually, they could create portals, doorways to other times, other places, other dimensions. Step through the portal, and you'd be somewhere, somewhen else. The implications were staggering. Time travel, teleportation, the ability to reshape reality according to human will. If any of this were true, it would represent the most significant technological advancement in human history. Of course, it would also be incredibly dangerous, and according to the mythology, the danger was part of the story too. Here's where the mythology takes its darkest turn. According to claims from Nichols and others, the most effective operators for the Montauk chair were children. Boys specifically, typically between the ages of 10 and 16. There was supposedly something about the pre-adolescent or adolescent mind that made it more receptive to the chair's effects, more malleable, more powerful, less constrained by the limitations that adult consciousness imposes on perception. These Montauk Boys were allegedly recruited from various sources. Some were the children of military personnel, families who were already embedded in the world of classified projects and could be trusted to keep secrets. Some were recruited from youth organizations, selected for tests that identified psychic potential, and some, the darkest claim, were runaways, homeless children, kids from foster care, young people whose disappearances wouldn't be investigated thoroughly. The children were brought to Montauk, trained in the use of the chair, and subjected to experiments. Some of the training was allegedly traumatic, because trauma can supposedly enhance psychic abilities, breaking down the mental barriers that prevent most people from accessing these latent powers. After their usefulness ended, or if they became unstable, or if they saw too much, their memories were erased. They were returned to their normal lives with no recollection of what had happened to them. Some, presumably, never returned at all. If this sounds familiar, it should. 11. From Stranger Things. A child raised in a government laboratory, experimented on to enhance her psychic powers, traumatized and abused by scientists, pursuing capabilities they barely understood. She's a Montauk boy, translated to fiction. Her story is the Montauk mythology, with a heroic arc grafted on. The victim who escapes, who fights back, who uses the powers they gave her against them. In the real Montauk mythology, there are no such heroes, just victims. Now, to be clear, there is no evidence that any of this actually happened. No children have come forward with consistent stories of being experimented on at Montauk. No documents support these claims. The entire narrative rests on the recovered memories of a handful of people, all of whom had reasons, financial, psychological, social, to tell dramatic stories. But the horror of the claim is why it resonates. Because we know we have documented proof that the US government has experimented on vulnerable people, including children. MK Ultra subjected people to trauma and abuse. Radiation experiments used children as test subjects. The Tuskegee study let men die of treatable diseases to gather data. The Montauk Boys are almost certainly fictional, but they're fictional in a way that echoes documented reality. That's why the story has power. That's why people believe it. The most spectacular claims of the Montauk mythology involve time travel. According to the story, the Montauk chair could open portals, doorways to other times and places. An operator would focus on a particular moment in history, and a tunnel would form. Step through, and you'd be there. Ancient Egypt, the future, the distant past. Al-Bielek claimed to have experienced this directly. When he and his brother supposedly jumped off the USS Eldridge During the Philadelphia experiment in 1943, they landed at Montauk in 1983, 40 years in the future. They were met by project personnel who knew they were coming, who had been waiting for this moment, because from the Montauk perspective, it had all already happened. Think about that for a moment. The mythology claims that the Philadelphia experiment in 1943 and the Montauk project in 1983 were connected through time itself, that the events at Montauk were partly designed to create the conditions that would allow the 1943 experiment to work. That time wasn't a straight line, but a loop, with effects preceding causes and causes following effects. Bielek claimed to have traveled further than 1983. He said he was sent to the year 2137, where he witnessed a devastated Earth recovering from nuclear war, and then to 6037, where humanity had evolved or transformed into something almost unrecognizable. These claims are, to put it mildly, extraordinary. They require not just secret government technology, but physics that doesn't exist in any theory we can verify. Time travel as depicted in the Montauk mythology would violate causality, create paradoxes, and require energy outputs that would be measurable from space. There's no evidence any of this occurred. No artifacts from the future. No verifiable predictions based on future knowledge. No physical evidence of portals or temporal displacement. Just stories. Compelling, elaborate, internally consistent stories. But stories nonetheless.
Every mythology needs a catastrophe, a moment when things went wrong. The Montauk mythology has the beast. According to the story, on August 12, 1983, an experiment went catastrophically wrong. A subject in the chair, some accounts say it was a particularly powerful Montauk boy, others say it was Preston Nichols himself, lost control. Instead of creating a stable portal or manifesting a controlled object, they manifested something from the depths of their subconscious. A monster, a beast. Some accounts describe it as a Bigfoot-like creature, others as something more alien, more incomprehensible. All accounts agree that it was hostile, violent, and very real. The beast rampaged through the underground facility. People were killed. How many depends on who's telling the story. The creature couldn't be contained by conventional means because it wasn't a conventional thing. It was a thought given form, a nightmare made flesh. In desperation, someone, Nichols claims it was him in some tellings, smashed the equipment, destroyed the transmitters and receivers that maintained the chair's field. The moment the equipment went offline, the beast vanished. Without the amplification technology, the manifestation couldn't sustain itself in physical reality. The project was shut down. The surviving personnel had their memories erased. The underground facilities were sealed. The surface installations were abandoned to decay and rust. And for almost a decade, the truth remained buried. Until Preston Nichols began recovering his memories. Until Al Bielek started telling his story. Until the mythology began to spread. If you've seen Stranger Things, you recognize this too. The Demogorgon, the Mind Flayer. Monsters from another dimension, breaking through because someone opened a door that should have stayed closed. The show is basically a Montauk story with better special effects and a more satisfying narrative arc. In Stranger Things, the heroes close the gate. They defeat the monsters. They rescue their friends and expose the conspiracy. In the Montauk mythology, there are no heroes, just victims, and a rusting radar dish, and stories that may or may not be true. Let's separate fact from fiction. Let's identify what can actually be verified about Camp Hero and Montauk, and what exists only in the realm of claim and counterclaim. Verified. Camp Hero existed. It was a real military installation, active from 1942 to 1981. You can visit it today. It's a state park. The bunkers are real. The radar dish is real. The underground tunnels are real. Verified. The base conducted classified work. As part of the SAGE air defense network, Montauk housed sophisticated radar equipment and coordinated with other facilities to track potential Soviet attacks. The details were classified at the time, and some remain classified today. This is normal for military installations, not evidence of anything sinister. Verified. Strange things have been reported near Montauk. Local residents have spoken of unusual phenomena, unexplained lights, strange sounds, electromagnetic disturbances. Of course, a massive radar installation pumping out high-powered radio waves would produce exactly such phenomena. Radar can interfere with electronics, create visual effects, cause strange sensations in people near the equipment. What some interpreted as evidence of exotic experiments was probably just the side effects of conventional technology. Verified. The base was abandoned with equipment in place. The AN/FPS-35 radar was left behind because it was too expensive and specialized to move. This creates an atmosphere of mystery. Why would they leave all this behind? But the actual answer is boringly practical. Decommissioned military equipment is often left in place when the cost of removal exceeds any benefit. Verified. MK Ultra was real. The government really did conduct mind control experiments on unwitting subjects. This isn't evidence for Montauk specifically, but it establishes that the government is capable of secret, unethical programs. The precedent exists. Everything beyond this is unverified. The Philadelphia experiment, the Montauk chair, the time travel, the Montauk Boys, the beast. All of it rests on the testimony of a handful of individuals, none of whom produced documentary evidence, none of whom were corroborated by independent witnesses, all of whom had financial incentives to tell spectacular stories. The Montauk mythology is built on the Philadelphia experiment, but the Philadelphia experiment itself has no credible support. The story originated with a man named Carl Allen, sometimes called Carlos Allende, who wrote letters to astronomer and UFO investigator Morris Jessup in the 1950s. Allen claimed to have witnessed the 1943 experiment from a nearby ship, seeing the Eldridge disappear in a flash of green light. Allen's letters were rambling, full of claims about Einstein and unified field theory and alien contact. His story changed over time. He later admitted, at least once, to making the whole thing up, though he recanted the admission and continued telling the story until his death. The Navy has consistently denied the experiment occurred. The logs of the USS Eldridge, which are available to researchers, show the ship was nowhere near Philadelphia on the dates when the experiment supposedly happened. Crew members who served on the Eldridge have said nothing unusual ever occurred. The scientific basis for the experiment, using electromagnetic fields to bend light around an object, rendering it invisible, doesn't work the way the legend describes. Einstein's unified field theory, which supposedly provided the theoretical foundation, was never completed
and doesn't predict anything like teleportation. In other words, the foundational event of the Montauk mythology is itself almost certainly fictional. The Philadelphia experiment didn't happen, which means the chain of events leading from 1943 to 1983, the continuous research program that supposedly culminated at Montauk, has no basis in reality. If the beginning is false, why should we believe the middle or the end? According to the mythology, hundreds of people worked on the Montauk project. Scientists, technicians, military personnel, the Montauk Boys themselves, support staff. Where are they? When MK Ultra was exposed, victims came forward. Velma Orlico, Linda McDonald, dozens of others. They had no connection to each other. They weren't trying to sell books or build careers. They were just people who had been damaged by government experiments and wanted acknowledgement and justice. Their stories were consistent. They described similar procedures, similar effects, similar damage. The CIA eventually admitted the program existed. Institutions acknowledged their involvement. The evidence accumulated from multiple independent sources. For Montauk, we have Preston Nichols, Al Bielek, and a small group of others, all of whom knew each other, all of whom were part of the same social and professional network, all of whom benefited from the mythology they were creating. No independent witnesses have come forward. No former Montauk Boys, now middle-aged adults, have recovered their memories and told consistent stories. No scientists or technicians have broken their silence on their deathbeds. No documents have leaked. The mythology's proponents explain this by saying the memory erasure was extraordinarily effective. Everyone who participated had their memories completely wiped. The few who recovered memories, Nichols, Bielek, were exceptions, perhaps because their involvement was deeper or their psychic sensitivity was higher. But this is unfalsifiable. You can't prove that thousands of people don't have memories of something. The absence of witnesses becomes, in the believer's framework, evidence of how good the cover-up was. At some point, you have to apply Occam's razor, which is more likely that a massive conspiracy employed thousands of people and erased all their memories so perfectly that no one except a handful of book-selling conspiracy theorists ever remembered anything, or that the handful of book-selling conspiracy theorists made it up. Time travel, teleportation, manifesting physical objects from thought. These aren't just unverified, they're physically impossible according to our current understanding of reality. Now, our understanding of reality could be incomplete. Physics has been wrong before. Scientists have been surprised before. We thought it was impossible has sometimes been followed by, but then we figured out how to do it. But there's a difference between impossible according to current theory and would require overturning everything we know about how the universe works. Time travel, as depicted in the Montauk mythology, would violate causality, the principle that effects follow causes, that the future can't change the past. Every experiment ever conducted, every observation ever made, supports causality. Overturning it would require not just new physics, but throwing out physics entirely. Manifesting objects from thought would violate conservation of energy and mass. Matter can't be created from nothing. You can convert energy to matter. That's what happens in particle accelerators. But you need tremendous amounts of energy, and you get tiny amounts of matter. Creating a hammer from thought would require energy inputs that would be visible from space. The Montauk mythology doesn't just claim that the government achieved remarkable engineering feats. It claims they achieve things that would require the laws of physics to be fundamentally wrong. And there's no evidence, none, that the laws of physics are wrong in the ways that would be required. Believers will say, but maybe they discovered new physics that we don't know about. Sure, maybe. But extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If someone tells you they can violate causality and manifest objects from thought, you need more than their word for it. You need demonstration, replication, evidence that can be examined by independent observers. No such evidence exists for Montauk, just stories. I want to be careful here. I'm not saying the government would never do something like this. We know they would, because they did. MK Ultra was real. Human experimentation happened. Cover-ups happened. Evidence was destroyed. What I'm saying is, this specific story almost certainly isn't true. The claims don't hold up. The evidence doesn't exist. The physics doesn't work. The witnesses are compromised. The foundational event, the Philadelphia experiment, appears to be fiction. The Montauk Project, as described by Nichols and Bielek and others, probably didn't happen. The rusting radar dish at Camp Hero is almost certainly just a rusting radar dish, not a monument to secret government time travel experiments. But, and this is the crucial but, the story exists because of something real. The government really did conduct secret experiments on citizens, really did lie about it, really did destroy evidence. That's documented, proven, admitted. And once you know that, once you've absorbed the reality of MK Ultra and Tuskegee and all the other horrors that actually occurred, stories like Montauk don't sound crazy anymore. They sound plausible. They sound like the kind of thing that could be true. That's the real legacy, not time travel, not psychic children, not monsters manifested from thought. The real legacy is the destruction of trust, the permanent uncertainty, the knowledge that sometimes the paranoid interpretation is the accurate one, and therefore we can never be sure when to stop being paranoid. The Montauk Project is probably fiction, but it's fiction that tells us something true about America, something uncomfortable, something we'd rather not acknowledge. Let's talk about what that something is. In 2015, two brothers from North Carolina pitched a television show to Netflix. Matt and Ross Duffer were in their early 30s, with a few film credits to their name, but nothing that had broken through to mainstream success. Their pitch was for a horror science fiction series set in the 1980s, combining influences from Steven Spielberg, John Carpenter, and Stephen King. The show was called Montauk. The original concept drew directly from the conspiracy theories we've been discussing. The setting was Long Island, at and around Camp Hero. The plot involved a secret government laboratory conducting experiments on children to develop psychic abilities. There was a young girl who escaped the facility, possessed of telekinetic powers that the scientists had helped unlock. There was an interdimensional threat, something from outside our reality, bleeding through because the experiments had torn a hole in space-time. The Duffers were explicit about their sources. They'd read the Montauk books. They'd absorbed the mythology. They saw it as the perfect foundation for a horror story that felt grounded in a particular American anxiety, the fear of what your government might be doing in secret. Netflix bought the pitch, but they suggested changes. The name Montauk was too specific, too tied to a particular conspiracy theory. It might attract the wrong kind of attention. either from believers who would be upset that their sacred mythology was being fictionalized, or from skeptics who would dismiss the show as conspiracy nonsense before giving it a chance. Better to create some distance. So Montauk became Hawkins, Long Island became Indiana. The coastal setting was swapped for small-town Midwest. The show was renamed Stranger Things, but the DNA remained. 11, the escaped test subject with psychic powers, is a Montauk boy, gender-swapped but otherwise recognizable. The laboratory beneath Hawkins Lab is the Montauk Underground Facility. The Upside Down is the other dimension that the Montauk experiments supposedly accessed. The Demogorgon, the Mind Flayer, all the monsters, they're descendants of the beast that Preston Nichols claimed emerged from someone's unconscious mind. The show even makes the connection explicit. In the series, the government program that created 11 is linked to MK Ultra. Dr. Martin Brenner, the scientist who runs the experiments, is clearly inspired by Sidney Gottlieb and Ewan Cameron, the real architects of real government mind control programs. The show grounds its fiction in documented history, making the impossible feel possible. Stranger Things premiered in July 2016 and became a global phenomenon. It's one of Netflix's most successful original series ever. It revived 80s nostalgia as a cultural force. It made Winona Ryder relevant again. It launched careers and influenced fashion and generated billions of dollars in merchandise and licensing. And at its core, it's the Montauk mythology, translated into mainstream entertainment. Here's what's fascinating about this transformation. The fictional version is more famous than the conspiracy theory that inspired it. Ask most people about government experiments on psychic children, and they'll think of 11, not the Montauk Boys. Ask about interdimensional portals opened by secret research, and they'll think of the Upside Down, not Preston Nichols' claims about time tunnels. The conspiracy theory has been absorbed by pop culture. It's been metabolized, transformed, made safe for consumption. What was once a fringe belief system is now a Netflix show that parents watch with their children. And in the process, something interesting happens. The real horror gets processed too. Because Stranger Things isn't just based on the Montauk mythology, it's based on MKULTRA, on real government experiments, on documented atrocities. The show takes the fact that the government tortured its own citizens and turns it into entertainment, scary, thrilling, ultimately cathartic entertainment, where the good guys win and the bad guys face consequences. 11 escapes. She finds friends, a family, a home. She uses her powers to fight back against the people who created her. She defeats the monsters. She saves the world. None of that happened to the real victims of government experimentation. The real victims, the people subjected to MKULTRA, the children used in radiation experiments, the men in Tuskegee, they didn't get superpowers. They didn't escape to fight another day. They got brain damage, memory loss, PTSD, death. Their perpetrators weren't defeated by heroic children with telekinesis. They retired with full pensions, were protected by their institutions, and died peacefully in their beds. Fiction gives us justice. Reality doesn't. And maybe that's why we need stories like Stranger Things. Not because they're true, but because they let us process truths that would otherwise be unbearable. The government really did experiment on children. That's horrifying. But if we can reframe it as a story where the children fight back and win, it becomes something we can engage with, something we can sit with in our living rooms, binge over a weekend, discuss on Twitter. Fiction makes the unbearable bearable. That's its purpose. That's its power. But we should be honest about what we're doing. When we watch Eleven face the Demogorgon, we're watching a fantasy of justice that was denied to real victims. When we cheer for the kids of Hawkins defeating the Mind Flayer, we're experiencing the catharsis that history refused to provide. The monsters in Stranger Things are fiction. The monsters who ran MKULTRA were real. The fictional monsters get defeated. The real monsters got away. That's the truth beneath the fiction. That's what Stranger Things and the Montauk mythology before it is really about. Why do conspiracy theories exist? There's a temptation to dismiss them as pathology, as the product of diseased minds, paranoid thinking, inability to accept mundane explanations. And sometimes that's accurate. Some conspiracy theories are clearly delusional, serving no function except to satisfy the psychological needs of their believers. But Montauk is different. Montauk emerged from documented reality. It's a mythology that grew in the shadow of proven atrocity. And it serves a function, not a healthy function necessarily, but a comprehensible one. When MK Ultra was exposed, Americans learned that their government was capable of things they'd thought unimaginable. Drugging citizens, torturing psychiatric patients, experimenting on prisoners, destroying evidence, protecting perpetrators. That's traumatic knowledge. It ruptures the basic trust that citizens need to have in their institutions. It creates a permanent anxiety. What else are they doing? What else don't we know? Conspiracy theories like Montauk are attempts to give shape to that anxiety. To say, yes, they're still doing terrible things. Here's what those things are. Here's the enemy. Here's the danger. Paradoxically, the conspiracy theory can be comforting because it provides certainty. It says, the government is experimenting with time travel at an abandoned base on Long Island. That's scary, but it's specific. It's knowable. It's something you can wrap your mind around. The alternative, the truth, is worse. Because the truth is uncertainty. The truth is, we don't know what the government is doing. We don't know what black budget programs exist. We don't know who's being experimented on or what techniques are being developed. We know they lied before, and they could be lying now, but we don't know about what. That's unbearable. That's an anxiety without shape, without boundary, without end. So people create Montauk. They create specific, detailed, ultimately manageable explanations for the unmanageable reality of institutional betrayal. They swap uncertainty for certainty, even if the certainty is false. I'm not defending conspiracy thinking. I'm trying to understand it. To recognize that it emerges from real trauma, real betrayal, real failure of trust. The solution isn't to dismiss people who believe in Montauk as crazy. The solution is to rebuild the trust that makes Montauk feel necessary, and we're nowhere close to doing that. Here's the intellectual trap that MK Ultra created. Before 1975, if someone said, the government is conducting mind control experiments on American citizens, you could reasonably dismiss them as paranoid. After 1975, that statement was documented fact. So now, when someone says the government is conducting time travel experiments at Montauk, how do you evaluate that claim? You can't simply dismiss it as impossible. The impossible has already been proven. The bar for what the government is capable of has been reset. MK Ultra showed us that institutions with power and secrecy will do terrible things. Things that seem unbelievable until they're documented. But you also can't believe every claim. Montauk requires physics that doesn't exist. It lacks the evidentiary support that MK Ultra had when it was exposed. The stories don't hold up to scrutiny. So where does that leave us? It leaves us in permanent uncertainty, a state of epistemological limbo, where we know our institutions are capable of the unthinkable, but we don't know exactly what unthinkable things they're currently doing. That's the MKAYULTRA problem. Not the specific atrocities that were committed. Those ended, or at least the specific program ended. The problem is what the exposure did to our ability to trust official narratives. When the government says, "We're not doing anything like that anymore," why should we believe them? They said MK Ultra didn't exist until forced to admit it did. They destroyed evidence. They protected the perpetrators. Every incentive to lie is still in place, but we also can't function with total distrust. We can't investigate everything. We can't assume every conspiracy theory is true. We don't have the resources, the expertise, or the access. So we're stuck, knowing too much to trust completely, knowing too little to trust selectively, living with an uncertainty that can never be resolved because the conditions that created it haven't changed. What's the honest position on Montauk? Let me try to articulate it. The specific claims, time travel, psychic chairs, interdimensional portals, are almost certainly false. They require physics that doesn't exist. They have no evidentiary support. The witnesses are compromised. The foundational event never happened. But the underlying anxiety that Montauk expresses, that the government conducts secret experiments on vulnerable people, that institutions lie and cover up their crimes, that power without accountability leads to atrocity, that anxiety is justified. It's based on documented history. The Montauk mythology is false in its specifics, but true in its architecture. It accurately captures something about the relationship between citizens and their government in post-MK Ultra America. We don't know what black budget programs exist today. We don't know what experiments are being conducted. We don't know who's being hurt. The absence of evidence isn't proof that nothing's happening. MK Ultra proved that the government can keep secrets for decades. The honest position is uncomfortable. It requires holding two thoughts simultaneously. Montauk is probably fiction, and something like Montauk could be real somewhere else. It requires being skeptical of specific claims while remaining open to the possibility that institutional secrecy conceals genuine horrors. That's not satisfying. It doesn't give you the certainty that conspiracy theory offers. It doesn't give you the dismissiveness that institutional trust offers. It leaves you in a state of permanent inquiry, always questioning, never quite certain. But that's where we are. That's the world MKAYULTRA created. And pretending otherwise, either by believing every conspiracy theory or dismissing all of them, is just another form of denial. This isn't just an intellectual exercise. There are practical implications. We can demand transparency, support FOI requests, push for declassification of old documents. The more information is available, the less space there is for mythology to grow. We can support accountability. When government crimes are exposed, as they occasionally are, we can push for prosecution, not just apology. Sidney Gottlieb died free.
That shouldn't happen again. We can think critically, not cynically. Cynicism is just another form of certainty, but critically, evaluating evidence, distinguishing between what's documented and what's claimed, asking who benefits from a particular narrative. We can be honest about uncertainty, not pretending to know things we don't know, not dismissing possibilities because they're uncomfortable, living with the ambiguity that reality demands. And we can remember. Stories like Montauk persist partly because the real history has been forgotten. MK Ultra isn't taught in most schools. It's not part of the standard American narrative. It's a shameful episode that institutions would prefer to bury. When we remember, when we keep the documented horrors in public consciousness, we reduce the need for mythology. The real story is bad enough. It doesn't need embellishment. It just needs to be told. That's what this channel tries to do. Not sensationalize, not invent. Just remember. Just dig through the archives and pull out the stories that power would prefer stayed buried. Montauk is a story about what happens when that remembering fails, when the real history gets suppressed and mythology grows in its place, when people who need explanations for their anxiety create explanations that feel true, even if they aren't. We can do better. We have to do better. Because the alternative is a world where no one knows what to believe, where truth and fiction are indistinguishable, where power can do whatever it wants behind a wall of secrecy and confusion. That's the world MKAYULTRA created. That's the world Montauk reflects, and it's the world we still live in today. Let's return to where we started. Montauk Point, Camp Hero, that massive radar dish rusting against the Long Island sky. It's a state park now. Families walk past it on hiking trails. Photographers capture its stark silhouette against sunset clouds. It's become almost charming in its decay, a piece of Cold War history preserved as a curiosity. You can't go inside the bunkers anymore. They've been sealed for safety reasons. The underground tunnels are inaccessible. Whatever's down there, probably nothing more than rusted equipment and accumulated debris, is locked away, invisible, unknowable. And that inaccessibility is part of the story's power. As long as we can't see what's underground, we can imagine anything. Time travel equipment, portals to other dimensions, the remnants of experiments too terrible to expose. The radar dish watches the horizon. It was designed to spot enemies approaching across the Atlantic, Soviet bombers that never came. Now it spots nothing at all. Its mechanisms frozen, its purpose obsolete. A monument to a war that was fought with paranoia and preparation rather than actual combat. But maybe that's the most honest symbol we could ask for. Because the Cold War wasn't really about Soviet bombers. It was about fear. Fear of annihilation, fear of infiltration, fear that the enemy could be anywhere, in our institutions, in our minds, in the thoughts of our neighbors. That fear made things possible. It justified MKAYULTRA. It justified surveillance of American citizens. It justified experiments that treated human beings as acceptable losses in the pursuit of strategic advantage. The fear didn't end when the Soviet Union collapsed. It just found new objects, new enemies, new justifications, and the machinery of fear, the infrastructure of secrecy, the culture of justified atrocity, the institutions that protect themselves above all else.
that machinery is still running, still watching, still doing things we don't know about, in places we can't see. The Montauk Project probably didn't happen, not the way the mythology describes it. There was probably no time travel, no psychic chairs, no children with telekinetic powers, no beast manifested from human consciousness. But the impulses that would have created such a project, the willingness to experiment on the vulnerable, the belief that national security justifies any means, the institutional capacity for secrecy and cover-up, those are real. Those are documented. Those are still with us. The specific story is fiction. The world that makes the story plausible is real. That's what the radar dish watches. Not the sky, not approaching bombers. It watches us, watches how we respond to uncertainty, watches whether we demand truth or accept mythology, watches whether we remember or forget. When Stranger Things releases its final season, millions of people will watch a fictional girl with psychic powers fight monsters from another dimension. They'll cheer when she wins. They'll cry when characters die. They'll feel the catharsis that good fiction provides, the sense that evil can be defeated, that victims can become heroes, that justice is possible. And beneath that entertainment, whether they know it or not, they'll be engaging with the same anxieties that created the Montauk mythology. The fear of secret government experiments, the knowledge that institutions lie, the suspicion that the most paranoid interpretation might be the accurate one. Stranger Things gives us resolution. The real story doesn't. The real story is still being written, in classified facilities whose names we don't know, in programs whose existence will only be revealed decades from now, if ever. In the permanent uncertainty that MK Ultra created and that nothing has resolved. The radar dish keeps watching. It will still be there when you visit, still pointing at the sky, still waiting for enemies that may or may not come. The question is, what will we be watching for? Time travel, psychic experiments, interdimensional portals. Those are probably fiction, or something more mundane but equally terrifying. The slow erosion of accountability, the normalization of secrecy, the acceptance that certain people are expendable, the forgetting that makes it all possible. Those are real. Those are still happening. Those are the monsters we actually need to fight. No superpowers required, just memory, just vigilance, just the refusal to accept that some truths should stay buried. This has been the story of the Montauk Project, the conspiracy theory that inspired Stranger Things, the mythology that grew in the shadow of documented horror, the fiction that tells us something true about the world we live in. The experiments probably never happened. The anxiety that created the stories is real, and the radar dish keeps watching. Thank you for joining me on this investigation. This one was different from our usual deep dives. Normally, we examine documented history, things that definitely happened, however horrible. Tonight, we examined a mythology, a story that probably isn't true in its specifics, but that tells us something important about the world that created it. If you haven't watched our MKAYULTRA video, I'd strongly recommend it. That's the documented foundation for everything we discussed tonight. The government program that was real, the experiments that actually happened, the victims whose suffering was verified by congressional testimony and institutional admission. Montauk is the shadow that MKAYULTRA cast. The mythology that grew because the reality was too horrifying and too uncertain
to process any other way. If you're planning to watch the final season of Stranger Things, watch it with this context in mind. Remember that 11 is a Montauk creation, filtered through Hollywood storytelling. Remember that the fictional laboratory in Hawkins is a stand-in for real facilities where real experiments happened. Remember that the catharsis the show provides, good defeating evil, victims becoming heroes, is the catharsis that history denied the real victims. Fiction helps us process reality, but we shouldn't mistake it for reality. We shouldn't let the satisfaction of fictional justice replace the demand for actual accountability. Let me know in the comments. What do you think about the Montauk mythology? Have you visited Camp Hero? Do you think there's something beneath the surface? Or is it just a rusting radar dish and the stories we tell about it? And if you found value in this investigation, if you think these stories deserve to be told, these questions deserve to be asked, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support makes it possible to keep digging through the archives, to keep shining light into the shadows that institutions would prefer stayed dark. Till next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember, sometimes the paranoid interpretation is the accurate one, but only sometimes. Learning to tell the difference is the work of a lifetime. This has been the Midnight Archives.